Hello, and welcome to Dallas, Texas. My name is Nalini Stamp, and I'm the Director of Strategy and Partnerships with the Working Families Party, and welcome to the Working Families Party 2020 endorsement process. We are here with former Secretary of Housing, Julian Castro. And before we give him a warm welcome, we want to thank everyone who's watching across the country, our members, our supporters, and our staff. And a special shout out to ACT TV for being our media partners today. We also today have Spanish translation. So para escuchar en español, por favor, llame al 605-313-5111-111. Código de acceso es 377569, and it should be on the screen as well. So before we get started, I want to talk about the WFP endorsement process. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Working Families Party, we are an independent grassroots party that's fighting for the many and not just the privileged few. If you want to throw down with us, we want you to text WFP 2020 to 738-674. We're endorsing a candidate because we believe that the way to beat Donald Trump is to endorse someone who has bold, transformative solutions that can finally structurally change this country. And in this process, we are modeling the type of democracy we believe we all deserve. So over the course of the next 2 weeks, we will be interviewing 6 candidates from the Working Families Party members, allies, and across the country. After all the candidates have taken your questions, in September, it'll come to a vote. And here's how the vote will work. The Working Families Party National Committee, that's made up of state chapters, movement allies, and national organizations, will have a half of the vote share. The members, the supporters, you out there and you in the room, will have equal share as well. The supporters and membership vote will be held online. So from September 4th through September 6th, there will be an affirmation period where supporters can affirm their values and participate in the process. And then September 9th through the 13th is the voting week, and you'll have all week to vote in the process. And the endorsement vote we are going to use is ranked choice voting. So here's how ranked choice voting works. Instead of just voting for one candidate, you get to actually rank all your favorites from first to last. If no one gets first and gets more than 50% of the combined vote, the bottom ranked candidate is eliminated and their votes are reallocated to those voters of their second choice. This process continues until one candidate comes out with an over 50% threshold and wins. That's it. That's the process. If you want to be a part of it, text WFP 2020 to 738-674. So let's give another warm welcome for his opening remarks, former Secretary of Housing, Julian Castro.
Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, gracias. Thank you, Nalini, and to all of the members of the Working Families Party. Thank you very much for having me, and to the great organizations that we have represented here in Dallas. It's good to be home. And to everybody who's watching around the country, thank you for all of your efforts to make sure that we have a country that is fairer and better for working families. I'm Julian Castro, and I always tell people these days I feel like I need a name tag because I have a twin brother, Joaquin. And Joaquin likes to go around telling people the way to tell us apart is that I'm a minute uglier than he is. But that's not true. I'm a minute older, and Joaquin and I grew up on the west side of San Antonio with my mother and my grandmother. My grandmother had come over to Texas in 1922 because she and her little sister had lost their parents. Their parents died, and their closest relatives lived in San Antonio. She never finished elementary school, so she worked as a maid, a cook, and a babysitter. And she raised my mother as a single parent. My mom raised my brother and me as a single parent after our parents split up when we were 8. I'm a proud product of the public schools of Texas. And growing up, with a mother that was a single mother and trying to support my brother and me and her mom, my grandmother, we knew what it was like to struggle, to worry about whether we were going to be able to make the rent payment on the first of the month, to have the electricity turned off sometimes, to take the bus to school, to work, to places that we were going to go, right? To not be guaranteed any kind of good outcome. But like so many families out there, my mom and my grandmother were hard workers. And they wanted better for my brother and me. We need to decide in this country whether we're going to make America work for everybody or not. Because right now our country is working very, very well for people at the very top and not very well for folks who are struggling, even working full-time jobs, who are still having trouble paying the rent, having trouble being able to afford health care in too many instances, oftentimes being reclassified as a part-time worker, no longer getting a pension or even a 401k. I want an America that is fairer and more prosperous and healthier and smarter, and ultimately is a place where no matter who you are or where you start, you can reach your dreams. I got into public service in the first place because I felt tremendously blessed with opportunity in our country. And the vision that I have for our country going forward is that every single young person can have the same kind of opportunity and reach their dreams, no matter what those dreams are. And I look forward to a conversation tonight with y'all about how we would make that happen.
Thank you. So let's get right to it. From the beginning of the Trump administration, and actually from the beginning of his campaign, he decided to put immigrants as a target. From the Muslim ban earlier in the administration to this week when they released a regulation that could make it easier to reject U.S. green card and visa applicants. Yeah. You have made headlines for calling for the repeal of Section 1325 of the U.S. Code that is currently being used to justify the separation of families. Can you explain why bold solutions like repealing 1325 are critical, especially in the wake of the recent raids? And what are you going to do about the enforcement agencies, ICE and CPB, who have been documented to have outrageous behavior these days?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This issue of immigration, some people have asked me, why was this the first policy issue that you put forward? And why have you spent so much time on it? I think, sometimes when some people ask me, they wonder, are you just the Latino guy that is just interested in this issue? And of course, I'm interested in a lot of different issues, and we put forward different policies. But I do have an interest in this issue because I grew up with a grandmother that had come over from Mexico. And like a lot of people who had come from different places, was an immigrant and was able to make a better life for herself and her family. And I know that the immigrants who are coming here today, documented and undocumented, are adding to the forward progress of our country. So I made a decision early on in this campaign that we were going to be bold and fearless. On this issue of immigration, I am not going to criminalize desperation. I am not going to criminalize desperation. I've called for the repeal of Section 1325, which basically makes it a misdemeanor to unlawfully enter the United States, because this is the law that Donald Trump has used to incarcerate migrant parents and then separate them from their little children. I want to guarantee that we don't have family separation in the years to come. And so this is one way that we can do that. People often ask, well, does that mean that there are no consequences or that you have open borders? It doesn't mean that we have open borders. First of all, there's still a civil system, as most people know. It's a civil system that mostly handles these issues of immigration. There's still that civil system in place. What I do believe, though, is that we need to put undocumented immigrants on a pathway to citizenship, that we need to end family separation and detention, that we need to fix our broken legal immigration system, because it takes too long when you do apply to actually want to get on track and become a citizen. And we need to break up ICE and get enforcement that is effective but also compassionate. Right? The culture of CBP and of ICE in many ways is run amok. Right? And so I would break up ICE and put some of those enforcement mechanisms into the Department of Justice, completely reform it, and put Homeland Security investigations off onto its own and ensure that we don't do what we saw in Mississippi a few days ago and break apart families, but instead that we respect people who have been here, who have been building a better life for themselves and for the community, and take a common sense and compassionate approach instead of the cruel approach that Donald Trump has taken. And I've said that Donald Trump has not been bashful in his cruelty, and I'm not going to be bashful in my common sense and compassion.
Thank you. So, a little bit broader, our country and the world face a set of acute intersecting crises, from soaring inequality to a warming planet, mass migration, rising white nationalism, existing and potential wars, to eroding trust in governing institutions and democracy itself, right? Each of the candidates we are considering for our endorsement has put forward, including yourself, ambitious plans to tackle at least some of these crises. But most, if not all, of these plans are sure to encounter opposition, especially from the Republican Party, of course, but also from moderate or centrist Democrats in the House and Senate, and from wealthy donors and corporations. So what really is your plan to take on that opposition? And can you be specific about organizations like ours and organizations in the room? How do we help in that, in accomplishing those goals?
This is a great question. I'm convinced that anytime you're trying to get legislation done, work done, that represents the best interests of the people of the country and not just certain powerful special interests, especially corporate interests, that you need to start off with greater accountability and transparency. And during my time in public service, from the time that I was on the city council, that's what I've tried to do. When I was a city councilman, I introduced the very first campaign finance legislation. It used to be like the Wild West in San Antonio. There were no campaign finance limits. In 2004, we put the first campaign finance limits into place. We also strengthened our ethics code and increased transparency so that people can understand where those connections are and who's doing what a lot better. And that's what I would work on as president. I believe that we need to take a huge spotlight and put it on the actions of the people that represent us in Congress. So I would do things like push legislation to overturn Citizens United so that we reduce the influence of big money and special interests in politics. I would make Congress subject to the Freedom of Information Act. FOIA. If you want to know what your city council member or your state representative is doing in most states, you can make a Freedom of Information Act request. Right? But if you want to know that about your congressional representative, they exempted themselves from the Freedom of Information Act. You can't do that. So this very body, and I say this with a twin brother that's a congressman, go get his records if you want. This very body that is the most important legislative body in our country, that has the widest scope and has the most people trying to influence it, you can't see what they're doing. I would immediately push legislation to change that and improve that with regard to the executive branch as well. On top of that, I do think that we need to engage people at a grassroots level. It can't just be the politicians, right? The push for change, whether it's for marriage equality or right now we're in the middle of a push for change for common sense gun safety legislation, it always has to come from the people. And so there is, I think, a struggle well beyond this 2020 election, which is to finally put in place in our time, in our era, a stronger progressive movement that builds coalition around these issues, that will continue into the presidency of hopefully a Democratic president in 2021 and beyond. That's the kind of administration I'd like to lead, in addition to being willing to jump over the filibuster. If the decision is between adhering to a 60-vote rule, the filibuster, that is nowhere in our Constitution, and that both political parties have thrown out the window when they see politically fit to do so, or convenient, or getting things like universal pre-K done, and universal child care done, or universal health care done, I'm going to choose doing those things instead of that filibuster so that we can get things done for the American people that they need.
Thank you. So we've seen attacks on the women's right to choose and abortion. So how will you protect people's rights to free, legal, and safe abortions in the United States?
I believe that that women should have the right to choose, and here's how we would protect it. Number one, I would appoint judges to the district court, the appellate court, and if the opportunity arises to the Supreme Court level, who will respect Roe versus Wade as precedent. Because you know what these conservatives are up to. They're looking for the perfect case right now to take up the chain of the federal court system so that they think they can overturn Roe versus Wade. We need to make sure that that does not happen. In addition to that, I would push legislation in Congress to try and codify Roe versus Wade, if we can, so that we have that as law, federal law. And do everything that we can from the Department of Justice to push back against states, whether it's Georgia or Missouri or Alabama, that are trying to abridge that right to choose. On top of that, as I said in that first debate, I don't only believe in reproductive freedom, I believe in reproductive justice. And so I would seek to end the Hyde Amendment so that no matter how much money you have or don't have, you're able to access reproductive health care, including an abortion. We also have to recognize that members of the trans community also have a concern about reproductive health care, and we want to be inclusive. That's part of reproductive justice. Reproductive justice also means access to birth control and to the information that people need to make decisions about what they're going to do, whether they are going to have an abortion or they're not going to have an abortion, that you give people all of the information and the resources that they need to fully live the life that they want to lead. Right? That's what I would do as president.
Thank you. So now a little bit about us. The Working Families Party is committed to building a multiracial mass base of working people across the country who are organizing to recruit and elect candidates on every level and up and down the ballot, and we have some in this very room. Thank you for those of you. Let's give a round of applause for those of you who are running for local office. Thank you. We have a track record of electing insurgent champions to office and translating those victories into policy wins. Increasingly, we want to support candidates who not only see the WFP as a valuable ally, but see it as their political home and the banner under which they'll march. What does the Working Families Party mean to you, and how will your campaign relate to the Working Families Party if we endorse you?
Yeah. Well, and let me say, Nalini, to you and to all of the members of the Working Families Party that are watching and to their allies and partners here, how much your work is needed now. Your voice is a very clear voice for people who are working for a living, who are struggling too oftentimes. And it's a pleasure for me to be here. My mother was once part of a third party, the Raza Unida party, and she was part of the old Chicano movement, and she once ran on this slate for city council in San Antonio called the Committee for Barrio Betterment. And there were 4 people in 1971, April of 1971, and the slogan of theirs, because I have the poster from when she ran, was "Give government back to the people." When I think of the Working Families Party, I think of giving government back to the people. And when I think of the party, I think that the mission is very clear: to make sure that people who have to work for a living, who are simply trying to provide for their family and to get ahead in this country, are well served by the policies that we put into place, and not people who are already doing very well off or big corporations that are doing very well, but the people that often don't have health care, that are having to work 2 jobs or struggling to pay the rent. That's what I think of when I think of the Working Families Party, a party that has stayed true to that mission. And your voice is important, it's crucial if we're actually going to get these policies into place. Because the folks on the other side that don't want to raise the minimum wage, that don't want to change the tax code, they want to keep it the way it is to keep rewarding the people at the very top, that don't want to extend health care, that don't want to pass anti-discrimination laws. They have their lobbyists, they have their powerful lawyers, they have, politicians that they're giving a lot of money to that will continue to support their causes. On the other side of that, you need people. And the better organized people are, and the more of a coalition that they can form, I think the stronger you are. And so I see the Working Families Party, if I'm president, as part of an indispensable coalition to get minimum wage done, to get better labor laws done, to get better environmental policy, and all of those things that we need to do to make sure that everybody can prosper, especially people that have to work for a living.
Thank you. So we have been doing this process with allies and partners across the country, and we will now have a question from our live stream. And we have Jasmine, who's calling in from Virginia with the Women's March. Jasmine? Ooh. Oh. Hold on one second. Yep, you got it. Sometimes it happens. Hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second, Jasmine. Talk now. Talk now.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Oh, it's getting a little bit louder, yeah.
Okay.
A little bit louder.
Okay, let's try and see.
Oh, I think you mute. Yeah, there you go.
We're good? Technical difficulty.
Yep.
I'll lean in to hear the question.
Okay. Women, especially women of color who are queer, disabled, or living in rural communities, have oftentimes been the least likely to benefit from policies and systems designed to improve our economy. Across the country, it's become normalized for politicians to discuss the middle class, and oftentimes that accepts the Republican premise that there's an underclass worthy of scorn and criminalization. So my question is, how can your campaign and presidency speak to, give a voice to, and give political agency to those who need economic opportunity the most, especially those who are out of work and underemployed?
Thank you very much. And remind me your name again?
Jasmine.
Jasmine. Which was how do we make sure that those often without a voice that are underserved and the poor, and including, of course, women of color that are out there and LGBTQ individuals around our country, how can we make sure that their voices are heard and the policy that we put into place benefits them? And one of the things, Jasmine, you said was that, which I agree with, that a lot of times these days we focus a lot on the middle class, but we don't talk as much about people who may be working poor or poor and not working right now. I have tried very intentionally during this campaign to talk about people who are poor. And the reason for that was, first of all, growing up, I grew up in neighborhoods where a lot of the people who were around me, and at different times my family, was impoverished. And so I know that just because you're poor doesn't say anything about who you are as a person, about the worth that you have as a person. Everybody has worth. And then when I was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, what I saw was that a lot of the people who were living in public housing or had a housing choice voucher that people like this administration write off as lazy or something's wrong with them. You can see that in the policy that they just announced, this public charge policy that, oh, if you're on a little bit of government assistance at some point, something's wrong with you. Right? I completely disagree with that. I don't think that just because you're poor that anything is wrong with you. And the policies that I would pursue as president and that I've talked about and put out as a presidential candidate relate not only to the middle class, but people who are poor. When it comes to housing, for instance, one of the things that I would do is that I would create an entitlement program out of the housing choice voucher program. So anybody that makes less than 50% of the area median income, they would be entitled to get a housing choice voucher. I would partner that with a push to get source of income discrimination prohibitions or laws put into place in all 50 states so that somebody can't deny you, a landlord can't deny you just because you have a voucher instead of cash or a check. Because too oftentimes there's still a stigma associated with people who have a voucher instead of paying with a check. I also have a plan to end homelessness in our country by 2028 by aggressively investing in driving down family homelessness, chronic homelessness, veteran homelessness, and youth homelessness. And when I was HUD Secretary, we spent a lot of time working on driving down the numbers of each of those types of homelessness, especially veteran homelessness. I think if you look at the different candidates in this election, I think we've put together the most intersectional policy out of all of the candidates. In my housing plan, for instance, I talk about the need to invest in the fair housing component of our efforts, right? To further make sure that if you go into the housing market and you're Black or you're Latino or Native American or Asian American or you're LGBTQ, that you can't be discriminated against. I've consistently championed the Equality Act so that you can't be discriminated against based on your sexual orientation or your gender identity. In my immigration plan, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, I recognize that it's people of different skin color, right, that are undocumented immigrants in this country, and that we often forget about, for instance, Black undocumented immigrants, and have talked about that. I've also talked about a rejection of Donald Trump's push to only accept immigrants who are already well off, and only have a merit-based system in place, because I don't believe that that's what's best for our country. I believe that there are a lot of people who come here who are poor, who are working hard, and who are making a better life for themselves, and we need to lift them up as well. So, I'm going to keep speaking on job creation, on education, on healthcare, on the environment, on housing, how all of these things intersect with people who are poor and people who are Black or Latino or anything else. And I think that, by the end of this campaign, that people will really see that's how we have to approach all of these issues and touch the lives of the people that you asked about. Right?
Thank you, Jasmine. Yeah, what a great room. So this next question is very near and dear to my heart. In the 1950s, my grandparents moved to the United States from Puerto Rico. It was the mass exodus of the island at the time because of conditions that were put in place of it being a colonial territory of the United States. So fast forward to right now, the island is caught in a debt crisis. Hurricane Maria left thousands dead and my family without power that still lived there for almost a year. And the government is caught up in corruption and scandal. I want to first thank you for being one of the first presidential candidates to call for the resignation of Governor Ricardo Rossello. Thank you. So would you join islanders and end the diaspora in demanding the cancellation of the debt and the end of the Financial Oversight and Management Board, aka the junta?
Yeah, I do support that, and that completely going in the other direction and making sure that instead of stifling austerity, that we make the investments in Puerto Rico that we need to make so that people can get a good education, that they can have something as simple as electricity. A lot of folks still don't have, some people still have electricity. A lot of areas still haven't recovered after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. I believe that this experiment, so to speak, that we've seen has not proven to be the path that is going to lead to the prosperity that we want to see there. It also, it's not lost on me that we invest a lot in foreign aid around the world, which I believe in. I believe it, and that we should continue to do. But the people of the island of Puerto Rico are our fellow Americans, and I believe that we need to make investments there so that they can get a good education, they can have good job opportunities, they can have a good quality of life. That was my first stop after I announced my candidacy for president, and I intend to go back. And hopefully we'll see progress in the next 2 years. But if I am elected president, I will make that a stronger priority going forward.
Thank you. So we have people have been asking questions via Crowdcast, and I believe we have Sarah in the audience who's going to ask the top voted question from our members at home watching.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us today, and thanks for everyone who's been submitting questions online. The top voted questions so far: what are your plans for increasing awareness, education, and protections of not just the LGBTQIA plus community as a whole, but also specifically the transgender rights community? How are you going to include transgender individuals in the transgender right movement in legal systems like identity and healthcare beyond just reproductive justice issues?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that question. During my time in public service, I've made the inclusion of the transgender community a real priority. When I was mayor of San Antonio, we did a non-discrimination ordinance in the fall of 2013. And our non-discrimination ordinance was, of course, the first of its kind for San Antonio and one of the first ones here in Texas. There were some, even allies, that suggested, well, you might consider removing the transgender community because people start, the right wing starts up its dishonest campaign about people going into bathrooms and a danger that's created, which is completely bogus, but does scare some people. Right? And so some people were saying, oh, well, maybe you want to take out the transgender community and go with a non-discrimination ordinance that includes everybody else. And we said no. We included the transgender community in that. When I got to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, we expanded the equal access rule to include the transgender rule, which says that if a transgender individual presents themselves at a publicly funded shelter, for instance, that they have to be accommodated according to their preference, how they identify, how they're comfortable, and they feel safe. On top of that, we worked on reducing homelessness amongst LGBTQ youth, including transgender individuals, who are often ones who find themselves homeless the most because they're not accepted at home, or things get so bad at home that they feel compelled to leave and they end up on the streets. And we wanted to address that. If I'm president, I will instruct my secretaries of Health and Human Services, of Housing, of Education, of each of the departments that has a role in making sure that basic civil rights are protected, the Department of Justice, and that somebody can have a good quality of life, to make protecting transgender individuals a priority, the way that I made it a priority when I was mayor and housing secretary.
Thank you. So in the audience, we have some folks we've invited to ask questions. And first up, from an allied organization that has made headlines for making the Green New Deal one of the front and center issues, is Priscilla from Sunrise Movement here in Dallas, Texas. Priscilla?
Buenas tardes, Julian.
Buenas
Had to
tardes.
get my Spanish in.
Yes.
So my name is Priscilla, and I am a coordinator for the Dallas hub of the Sunrise Movement. Today I have a question for you on behalf of our team. In the 1930s, we faced the existential threats of the Great Depression and World War II. Our nation's New Deal and mobilization during World War II to defeat the Axis rose to the scale of the crises at the time, created America's middle class, and permanently expanded the social safety net for a generation of Americans. Today, we face new existential crises which threaten our nation and the very planet we live on. Intersectionally, record levels of inequality, and the impending climate crisis. In response, we need a Green New Deal that mobilizes our economy over the next decade to tackle the climate crisis, creates millions of good jobs, ensures Americans with economic prosperity, guarantees clean air and water for every zip code in the U.S., and establishes a new social safety net fit for the 21st century. How would you unite the nation around this national project as outlined by Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey, and what is your plan to make the vision of the Green New Deal a reality?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And we just got another report the other day that said that our food supply is being harmed by climate change. You all saw the report about a year ago that said we have about a dozen years to make serious progress on this issue before the consequences could be tragic. And so all of the red flags and the sirens are going off right now that we have to act. I have said very clearly that my first executive order, if I'm elected president, on my first day in office will be to recommit the United States to the Paris Climate Accord so that we lead again immediately on sustainability, and then to go around the world and get stronger commitments from our allies and our adversaries to get to net zero. I believe at latest 2050 should be when we get to net zero, if not before then. In order to do that, I believe what we need to do is make Americans understand, and I think a lot do, that we can do two things at once. We can protect our planet, we can invest in a Green New Deal to get to net zero here and lead so that other countries around the world help us get there. Have clean air, have clean water, and then also create great jobs in the clean energy economy. Right? We see that here in Texas, in our home state, right? In the wind energy industry, the solar energy industry. We see that in other renewables. You see that in a number of other states in our country. And so I think that we have a real story to tell about being able to do right by our planet and also ensure that people can go to work. They already are. You know? When I was mayor of San Antonio, I sat on the board of the local public utility, CPS Energy, and we started to move it away from fossil fuels. We decided to close a coal-fired plant and invested in a 400 megawatt solar facility. But we didn't stop there. We also incentivized the location in San Antonio of 800 jobs that came with the manufacturing of those solar panels, so that it was a double victory. And you know, that industry, those industries are always changing. But there's no reason that China should lead when it comes to creating jobs in the clean energy economy. The United States should lead and drive down emissions and make sure that we have cleaner water and clean air. The other thing that I would do is that I would appoint an EPA director that actually believes in environmental protection, right? And people underneath that person and at the Department of Justice that will enforce our environmental laws. Because right now, as you know, what's happening is that they're weakening those laws and rules at the EPA, and then they're not enforcing them. And so people are getting away with violating those laws. I would make sure that we enforce the laws that we have in the books, and then we strengthen those laws and invest in a Green New Deal so that we can have both economic growth and getting to net zero.
Thank you.
So as president, how will you concretely address the epidemic of violence against Black trans women without increasing mass incarceration that disproportionately impacts people of color?
Yeah, and you know, that's an important question because you know, we've seen the statistics. You got a little sound effect there. Yeah. We've seen the statistics of the number of Black trans women who have been murdered, who have been found dead. And I think we need to do several things. First of all, this goes back, and let me just connect the dots to housing, for instance, and educational and job opportunities. We need to make sure that instead of stigmatizing the trans community, that they're able to fully participate in American life, in our education system, our school system, in housing opportunity, in the ability to get shelter if they're homeless, because as you know, that is one of the big challenges for the trans community. You have a disproportionate number of people who find themselves homeless. That's why it's important to enforce our anti-discrimination laws and to provide greater housing opportunity to folks. And when it comes to job opportunities, I support the Equality Act, for instance, that would make sure that you can't be discriminated against because of your gender identity, so that people have the chance to have gainful employment. This also intersects with race, too. And I want police departments across the country to take this seriously, right? To investigate these crimes, to make sure that they're doing what they can to understand, to be better trained, to work with the trans community and groups that are out there to help prevent these crimes in the first place. And I think that we still have a lot of work to do there. And so I don't think that the answer is to, you know, overly imprison people. I think the answer is to respect people, to give them the educational opportunity, the housing opportunity, the job opportunity that they need, to make sure that we do that in a way that says if your skin is black or if your gender identity, whatever it is, you can't be discriminated against. And to be cognizant of both of those things. That's what I would instruct my Department of Housing and Urban Development, my Education Department, Labor Department, and Department of Justice to do.
Thank you. So we're going to another question from our audience. We have Sue Jones from one of our state committee organizations, the Texas Organizing Project. Sue, your question for Julian.
Hello, Secretary Castro. Thank you for spending your evening with us here in Dallas. Quite hot. My question is about health care. Texas has the highest number of people who are uninsured, and we are number 7 on the maternal mortality rate, primarily women of color. When you announced your candidacy for president, you stated on the MSNBC show Chris Hayes that health care reform would be the first bill you would work on. And since this issue is not included on your campaign website, can you tell me what's your plan and why it's not on your website?
Yeah, no, thank you. So let me answer that first. We're rolling out our policy, right? We just rolled out, we started with immigration, housing, education, police reform, indigenous communities. Today we rolled out this Working Families First economic policy. We'll be doing climate change, healthcare. So we will, well before anybody votes, we will get our policy all out there. But we want to also, we're putting it out kind of piece by piece to be able to let people digest it. And it is a campaign, so we're spreading it out to try and make sure we're getting in the news and getting the attention that we want out of the campaign aspect of it. But what I believe is that we should base our healthcare system off of Medicare. That we should strengthen Medicare for the people who are on it and then expand it to anybody who wants it. I often tell the story of my grandmother who had diabetes. She was a type 2 diabetic. And my brother and I grew up with her and my mom has type 2 diabetes today. Thank God right now I don't have it. But my grandmother's condition got worse and worse, and right before she passed away, she had to have one of her feet amputated, which is very common for severe diabetics. But that whole time, she had Medicare. And so we knew that she was going to get at least some base level of care. I want to make sure that Medicare is always there for people who need it and that we expand it to everybody. I also believe that if somebody has a strong health insurance plan, one that is solid, and they want to hold on to that, that they should be able to hold on to that, that we can accomplish both of those things. What I don't believe is that the profit motive of big pharma or big insurance companies should ever dictate whether somebody is able to get health insurance or health care, not insurance, health care, when they need it. And here in Texas, we know that too many people have to go to Mexico, for instance, to get their medication or to get a medical procedure done or a dental procedure. And there's no reason that that should be the case. And so we would invest significantly in a healthcare system that is based off of Medicare, where you would have the private option, if you want, of having your private health insurance plan. But the default would be a Medicare-based system. On top of that, I believe that we need to ensure that no matter what the color of your skin is or your background, that you're treated the same in our healthcare system. This difference in the maternal mortality rate between black mothers and white mothers and other differences that there are in how people are treated, we need to ensure that our hospitals are held to a standard or held accountable to treat patients the same, that we get better about incentivizing that and also enforcing it. The last thing I'll say about this is that I also believe that we need to end this distinction between physical health care and mental health care and make sure that we invest in mental health care. And because there are a lot of people that suffer in silence with a stigma too of if they have bipolar disorder, depression, or schizophrenia, or something else, and they never get the care that they need, either because it's not covered well enough, or they're not insured, or they're embarrassed to go and get the care that they should get. And this is also a problem, especially in rural communities, because a lot of rural hospitals have been shutting down inpatient psychiatric units or OBGYN units. So we also have to make sure that there's parity in terms of access to good quality health care for people that live in small towns in Texas or Iowa or Ohio or wherever they're at, because right now we're not living up to that.
Thank you, Sue. This is from a veteran leader, Pam Campos Palma. who's also a strong ally of the Working Families Party. Increasingly, Americans acknowledge that we have a problem with writing a blank check for never-ending war. In recent years, under this administration, the Pentagon's budget has been pushed to heights not seen since World War II. Meanwhile, the Pentagon still cannot pass an audit, and every other day we hear another case of a Pentagon contractor ripping off taxpayers. As president, what will you do to restore fiscal sanity and oversight to end a corrupt war economy?
Well, I mean, I would get us out of those wars. I believe that a lot of people know in this country that we need to withdraw from places like Afghanistan and Syria. Obviously, we need to do that in an orderly way, because I think you have to be thoughtful before you go in. Like Iraq was a mistake going in. You also have to be thoughtful coming out. We do have to withdraw, but you also have to be thoughtful about that. I disagree with the president, who tweets all of a sudden that we're going to withdraw from a country without consulting, military officials or our allies on how we should do that, and then he had to backtrack on that. But we need to withdraw. It's estimated, Brown University did this analysis not too long ago that estimated that not only in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and several other countries that we've been involved in post 9/11, but that in the post 9/11 timeframe, just since 9/11, that we've spent $6 trillion on our military in different engagements overseas. And that those $6 trillion could have funded 100 years worth of tuition-free college, 250 years worth of universal pre-K, 45 million affordable homes for people. There is an opportunity cost, a very serious cost to these forever wars. And I'm one of the few candidates that has signed a pledge to end these forever wars and make sure that even as we, of course, keep our nation safe, that we scrutinize the budget of the Department of Defense just like we do every other department, and make sure that we can make as much investment as possible here to ensure that Americans can prosper, that we can make those investments in our public schools, in more affordable housing, in a better healthcare system, and everything that people need to prosper in the 21st century.
Thank you. So yesterday, I hear there was an action at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport that lots of folks have joined, and this question is from our friends at SEIU. Airport jobs used to be good union jobs until greedy airlines rigged the rules against workers, taxpayers, and passengers. They're fueling their $35.5 billion of profit, undermining their contracts with unions, and contracted those jobs out to the lowest bidder. Often irresponsible contractors that cut corners in wages, benefits, and safety. Airlines outsource 95% of baggage handler jobs and cut their wages in half. Now airlines are using contractors and sometimes pay them $2.13 to workers who are unfairly labeled tipped workers. How will you stop this race to the bottom? What will you do to make sure the airport workers are paid at least $15 an hour and have the right to form a union?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, and as part of this Working Families First agenda, I, like many other people, support legislation that the House has passed for $15 of minimum wage. We really need to go higher than that because, but it's been 10 years since we raised the minimum wage, and so, if we could get $15 an hour very early on in 2021 and then build off of that, I actually would like it to be automatically indexed every year so that we don't have to go back to Congress. And it's fascinating to me that a lot of these congressional representatives would be happy to raise their own salary, but not raise the minimum wage. Right? We need to make it index automatically so that you don't have to go back all the time. And that provides certainty to employers too, right? There's a certainty to that. I support the PRO Act in Congress that would, on the private sector side, ensure that unions are more effectively able to organize and to represent a greater percentage of workers than they do today. Because the last number I saw, I think, was that union membership as a whole had basically fallen I think underneath 12% or maybe into the single digits. Compared to where it was, it's fallen a lot. The good news is, in some states, it's actually rising again across our country, right? Because people right now recognize this great inequality that exists and that labor is essential. Labor organizations are essential to create more of a balance. And so I would support legislation that makes it easier and more convenient for labor unions to organize on the private sector side with airport workers, with every other type of worker.
Thank you. So we're going to kick it back to New York, and let's just make sure we can hear this computer. In New York, we have Winsome Pendergrass from New York Communities for Change, one of our New York affiliates and founders of the party. Winsome, let's see.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
So, greetings from the wonderful state of New York.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm saying greeting from the wonderful state of New York. As you might have known, we have one of the biggest fights since January, where we really took to the street for the sake of the tenants. Tenants have been suffering so badly in New York by the real estate people. What we would like to know, both New York Community for Change and the Upstate Downstate Coalition, is when you become president, do you support state passing universal rent control?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. I do believe that states and localities should have the ability to implement rent control. And as I'm sure you know, in California recently, that issue was taken up about local communities being able to implement rent control. I don't think it passed, but I do think that it was a look at what more states are going to be taking up, and that we need to give states and local communities the tools to implement rent control where it makes sense, because we've seen the rent absolutely skyrocket. Like, we have a rental affordability crisis in this country, and we need to give local communities more tools to be able to protect, especially tenants on fixed incomes and lower income tenants who have been there for years, working hard, full-time job, having to put in more than 40 hours a lot of times, but they cannot they can't afford the rent as it continues to skyrocket. On top of that, I put forth an entire housing plan on other tools that we need to utilize, from making the Housing Choice Voucher Program an entitlement program, to funding a greater supply of affordable housing through investing $40 billion in the National Housing Trust Fund, and increasing the low-income housing tax credit, as well as community development block grants, or CDBG, and home funding, so that we can produce more units of affordable housing out there. And I was in Des Moines, Iowa, just a couple of days ago talking about this. We need to hold local communities more accountable for their land use requirements and their zoning requirements, because too oftentimes what we have a lot of NIMBYism out there that makes it impossible to create more affordable housing. And I want to reward those communities that get beyond that. And so I would link up our grants, federal grants, to whether communities actually implement land use codes that make it easier to do housing that is affordable in a community. Because it's a crisis. It is a crisis. And linking land use with federal grants, I think, would send the right signal to local communities that they can't only listen to the voices of people that never want affordable housing anywhere around. They have to create that affordable housing.
Thank you, New York. Sweet spot for my home state. So now we're going to turn it to someone on our leadership committee here in the room in Texas, Devante Peters. Devante, your question for the secretary.
Hey man, say man. All right. Yeah, so my name is Devante Peters. I also a lot of people in the room know me as Brother Shaw. But so recently we had a story a story hit the media about us, patrolling our community, trying to keep people safe, and what we're doing, we call it community engagement. We want to engage our community outside of patrolling and things like that. We feed our community. We connect people to resources, and what we're essentially doing, me and my brother Marcus X right here, what we're essentially doing is trying to connect people to resources and kind of circumvent the prison pipeline that's going on in our community. So my questions are in regards to your stance on for-profit prisons. Would you support permanently ending for-profit prisons? And then my next question would be, would you support creating a federal department that is dedicated exclusively to basically addressing corruption in law enforcement and government agencies?
Thank you very much. First, to answer your first question, I absolutely do support ending for-profit prisons. I've said that, and most recently we've been reminded about this in the context of immigration, right? Where these for-profit entities have an incentive for more people to be rounded up and to put into their basically prisons. But that goes for our criminal justice system in general. Right? I don't believe that people should have a profit motive for more people to end up behind bars. Right? And that's what we have right now. And so we need to work in the other direction. We need to work so that more people or less people end up in prison in the first place. And so I've talked about, in addition to doing everything we need to do with more educational opportunity, more housing opportunity, more job opportunity, I've talked about diversion programs so that we legalize things like marijuana, but then also divert people away from being behind bars and being able to stay out and maybe get the help they need. If they commit a low-level crime, instead of putting them behind bars, ensure that they can get the help they need to get on a productive path. Right? Because I think especially too many young people of color get caught up in a criminal justice system that puts a big X on their record. And I was having this conversation about, I'm losing sense of time because I've traveled so much over these last few months, but I was in Salt Lake City at the University of Utah, and with these people, this group that does education programs for incarcerated individuals. And I was talking, I said, we want to give folks an effective second chance. And somebody raised a very good point. They said, well, the problem is that a lot of people don't get a first chance. Right? And I want to, everything that I have put out on education, on housing, on jobs, on police reform, and criminal justice has been so that people can have an effective first chance. They never end up behind bars in the first place. I see my police reform proposal as that. I haven't called for a separate department, but what I have called for is invigorating the Department of Justice in the division that we have that deals with excessive force, setting a national use of force standard that says that a police officer shall only be able to use lethal force if they've exhausted all the other reasonable alternatives to lethal force in that situation. That should be the same whether you're in Dallas or you're in San Francisco or you're in a small town in Pennsylvania, because why should it be different based on your skin color or what town you're in? It shouldn't, right? It should be the same. And that we would withhold federal grants from police departments that don't implement that standard and then somebody gets hurt because of it. And I also have called for demilitarizing our police, because we've been giving these this military equipment over the last 20 years to police departments, and I think that's not the answer. I recognize that our police do a dangerous job, and we saw last night in Philadelphia, they do a dangerous job. I'm very appreciative of the work that a lot of our police officers do, but I also believe that we have a problem of law enforcement using excessive force too often, especially on young black men. And I have not been shy to say that very bluntly. And so those are some of the things that I would do. But my police reform plan is on my website at juliancastro.com. That's more extensive on what we would do. All right. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, our hour has come to an end, but before that, Secretary Castro, you get to make your final case to the members and those watching who are going to vote in our process. So, Secretary Castro.
Well, first of all, gracias again. Thank you very much to everybody here in Dallas, to everybody who's watching, and especially to the members and the leadership of the Working Families Party. Look, I want an America where no matter who you are, you can reach your dreams. I want an America where everyone counts. In order to get that kind of America, it's going to take a struggle. It's going to take a fight. It's going to take a coalition of people who are willing to make people uncomfortable, to reverse this slide that we've been on for 40 years of a system that is more and more for the wealthy and for big corporations instead of people who are struggling, people who have to work for a living, families that find it harder and harder to prosper. During this campaign, I have set out a bold vision, a fearless vision, for us to become a country that is smarter, that is healthier, that is fairer for everybody, and because of those things is more prosperous. I've set out plans on housing, on education, on police reform, today on what we need to do to benefit working families, that I think will give families the tools that they need, no matter their skin color or where they live or how much money they don't have or have right now, the tools that they need to prosper in this 21st century. And I've been fighting for families like that ever since I got into public service. And I will continue to do that during this campaign, and especially if I'm elected president. I think that people are looking for three things in a candidate this year. They're looking for somebody with the right experience to be president, somebody with the right vision, and somebody that can beat Donald Trump. Yes. That's very important. And, you know, I'm one of the few candidates in this race with strong executive experience, having served as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and the Mayor of San Antonio. I have a strong, compelling, and positive vision for the country in the years ahead to become the smartest, the healthiest, the fairest, and the most prosperous country. And I can go and get those 75,000 votes that we lost by in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And I believe that I can also go get the 11 electoral votes of Arizona, the 29 electoral votes of Florida, and the 38 electoral votes of my home state of Texas, and win. And together we can make sure that on January 20th, 2021, we say adios to Donald Trump. Thank you very much. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That concludes this Q&A. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to the folks in the room. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. If you want to participate in further Q&As with other candidates or get updates on how to vote in our process, text WFP 2020 to 738-674 and join us on Saturday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern for another interview with yours truly. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Well done. Very well done.
Thank you. And for folks in the room, we're going to...